Hi guys, Miss Yandell here. I hope you're having a really great week. I hope you're enjoying the reading thus far in this American Lit 2 class. I hope that you enjoyed last week's reading of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. For some of you, it may have been your first reading, and for others, maybe a rereading. And as I said last week, I think it's always interesting to read a work like that again and to read it with adult eyes and adult perceptions. So I look forward to reading your essays about Mark Twain's work. One thing I'd like to say before I go forward today is I want to encourage you, if you liked Mark Twain, and even if you were kind of like, not so sure, he has many short stories that don't take long to read, but they're very enlightening and challenging and thought-inspiring. So I would encourage you to look up and get a used book online or in a used bookstore or something like that, and get a collection of his short stories. In graduate school, one of the classes I actually took one semester, it was a class on Mark Twain and his short stories, and that's all we looked at. We didn't even look at his novels, so we covered those in other classes. But I really thoroughly enjoyed that, and I want to say, if novel reading is too much for you, or maybe you just don't have the time for lengthy novels all of the time, I would encourage you to read more of Mark Twain's work. Now, I know this anthology included The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, but that's not even really typical of his greatest body of work with short stories, and I encourage you to kind of think about what he has to say through his short stories. And they're not just funny or silly or whatever, and sometimes we can write them off as being so, especially like The Notorious Jumping Frog. But he has a lot of really interesting works that discuss and critique his society and culture at the time. And as I've told you, reading those can inspire us to ask questions about our own culture and think about how things are, how they've changed, and how they still need to change. Well, speaking of, I want to talk about a feminist writer that we're reading for this week, and that's Kate Chopin. If you had me in Introduction to Literature, we read some of these works in Intro to Lit. And if you had me in class, I know that I spent some time talking about her in class in an Introduction to Literature class. I love talking about her as a feminist writer. So let's back up just a minute and just refer to feminism. For many people, unfortunately, feminism has gotten a bad rap. The word itself, there's denotation, dictionary, definition, and connotation, the way we feel about a word, or the emotional kind of things that are attached to that word. And feminism for some people is like an F word, and you know what I mean by that. It's like, oh, feminist, oh gosh, she's a feminist, oh Lord, here we go, burn the bra, anti-man. But one thing that I've always loved about Kate Chopin is that she's not anti-male. She's not a male basher. She's not a man basher, and she doesn't demonize men. And I would like you to write that down somewhere, demonize men. She doesn't do that, and that means make them into some evil kind of being or force. We hear about, dang the patriarchy, blah, blah, blah. She's not like that. As a matter of fact, she looks at gender roles in the context of the culture and the society where she is. And her critique is not against men, it's against how women, the expectations upon women, the limitations on women, and this is a very interesting concept. I love this area of feminism because it really makes you think about what are the roles of males in the culture, what are the roles of females in the culture, and how are they both, what are the expectations of both, and how are they both limited by those expectations. Kate Chopin's very interesting. Her men are not bad people. I mean, well, when you read The Storm, bless us. I mean, you know what I'm saying? That gets into naturalism. But as far as feminism is concerned, like, think about The Story of an Hour. When you read that, the husband in that story is a wonderful person. I mean, you hear that he loves his wife. He's never looked upon her save in love, the story says. And that means that he always looks at her with affection, and he cares about her. And so she's not demonizing him. What is she demonizing? What is she critiquing? And it's the expectations of women, loveless marriages, that women have to get married and have certain expectations, and The woman in the Story of an Hour is very limited to her boxy house. Think about the way that Chopin constructs the stories visually. What does it look like? This poor woman, when she thinks her husband's dead, she's looking out of an open window, looking at the sky, looking at the street, at some wanderer walking by, and thinking about how restricted she's been. Free at last. Free body and soul, she says. She's free at last. She feels freedom when her husband passes, not because she hated him, although the story suggests that she loves him sometimes. She loved him sometimes. But this was not a marriage that she got involved in because she adored him and loved him. It was one of convenience. And that is a critique against a society where people kind of feel like something's wrong with them if they're not married by a specific time. FYI, we still have in areas and in our culture certain expectations. I've heard people say to me many, many times, I get critiqued because I'm not married. I'm 21 and I'm not married with 2 kids. Okay, some people feel that kind of pressure, and thankfully in our culture today, we can choose, we have more options, but we still undergo those kinds of pressures. And so one thing I want to encourage you to think about is what we call gender studies. So there are feminist studies, and by the way, men and women study feminist studies, but feminist studies really focus on the roles of women, right? Expectations of women, socioeconomic roles of women, etc. Are they empowered? How are they not empowered? And but I think a really great way to think of feminism in this way is, and especially with Kate Chopin, is gender study, because she's really kind of taking us to a place and showing us certain relationships and begging us to think about why certain things are expected of people, and is that right? Is that fair? Okay, well, shifting gears just a moment here, I do want to say with Desiree's baby, I have fun with that one, okay, because she's unafraid to address issues that are extremely important and extremely controversial at the time. And because of this, after her initial popularity, and I'm sure you've read this by now, after her initial popularity, she's basically blacklisted. She can't get anyone to publish her. No one's reading her because they consider her to be a woman who's saying too much, pushing the envelope too much. So when she writes of a woman who's trapped in a marriage, and then in The Awakening, a woman who runs away from her husband and children and commits suicide, these are things that are pushing the envelope. One thing you need to know is that she has, relatively speaking, only been recently discovered, and it was after her death that people rediscovered her writings. And by the way, they're brilliant. And so when you read her, realize that you're reading a very important, forward, progressive voice at this time period. Remember where we are in history. This is the post-Civil War, since the Civil War. So things legally are changing. People feel, at least idealistically speaking, a sense of empowerment that they haven't felt before. And her voice is, while it's received to some extent, some people want to limit her. Well, I understand what you're saying, but don't go too far. So here's the thing. So when Desiree's baby is, that's about race and race confusion, and this does not make people, especially in the South. Remember, she hails from she has roots in Louisiana, for goodness sakes, and she has this voice about, what is race exactly, and what does it mean to be white or black, or what shade you are. She asks some very progressive questions for a woman. And anyway, and then when you go at the Acadian Ball, and then you go to the Storm, those of you who have been in class with me to hear about the Storm, this is a piece that's all about naturalism. It's about sexual impulse and sexual attraction. It's about, what do you do when you're married and somebody who comes to your house and pushes your buttons. And by the way, I just will say, this woman, you may be, if you read this piece and you're really reading it, it's like OMG, this stuff is scandalous. No wonder people were freaking out. When we read this in class, when I have like an intro lit and we read this in class, we have time to read her in class, I mean, people still flush. I mean, it's like when you're reading this out loud and discussing it, it's like, okay, right? But here she is at the turn of the last century talking about sexual attraction and what happens when people get around each other who are sexually attracted to each other. What? I will say on her behalf, the woman character in the story, while not completely sympathetic, I mean, it's not her fault that that actually goes down. That's what her suggestion is. It's nature. Remember, in the storm is a character. It's pushing them together. And I don't want to give everything away, but I do want to say this woman is very progressive, and this idea of naturalism being in the storm is very important. It's unfortunate, though, that at the time she was considered too controversial and her voice wasn't heard. But now we have the benefit of being able to listen with, I would think, open ears to what she has to say to us. And this, I think her works speak volumes. So as you go into your analysis of her and your thoughts of her, even if you've written your essay, so go to the discussion board and kind of think about the 4 works that we've read this week and what they're about. If you're interested in her at all, I have a whole collection of her works. I read her when I don't, when I'm like looking for something to read, I'll read one of her pieces. If you're interested in looking up The Awakening, go ahead and look that up as your discussion board. I'd love to hear what you have to say about the ideas of that. But anyway, she's an extremely important voice. And I want to say that as we go forward, we're going to hear from different voices and people. The Emancipation Proclamation gave hope to many people who felt oppressed, who felt limited, and think about that as you go forward. As always, think about, as you write, how do her ideas relate to us today? How can we apply them to today's life? And all right. Well, that's, I guess, all I have to say for today. I hope you have a great week. I look forward to reading your discussion board postings. I will see you next week. Bye-bye.